the past 2,000 years, believers have wondered what the prophecies in the book of Revelations truly meant.
Google's Gemini AI was designed to analyze data and find patterns.
Google Gemini is one of the best AI chatbots and AI models available today.
When someone asked it to scan the Bible for contradictions, everyone expected a list of flaws. Instead, Gemini gave an answer that shocked both scientists and believers. What it discovered changed the conversation completely. The setup: when AI meets Scripture. Let me tell you how this started. Google's Gemini AI launched as one of the most advanced language models available. Unlike earlier systems, Gemini can process huge amounts of information and find connections across different sources. It was built with multimodal capabilities, meaning it could analyze text, understand context, and identify patterns in ways previous AI systems couldn't match. The Bible has been studied for thousands of years. Scholars have dedicated their entire lives to understanding its pages. Universities have entire departments focused on biblical studies. Critics have pointed out apparent contradictions for centuries. Believers have written countless books defending its accuracy. The text has been translated into more languages than any other book in human history. When users started asking Gemini to find contradictions in the Bible, people expected the usual examples: different genealogies of Jesus in Matthew and Luke, varying accounts of the resurrection between the four Gospels, timeline differences between the Synoptic Gospels and John, the creation accounts in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. These are well-known discussions in academic circles that have been debated for generations. Nobody expected what happened next. What made Gemini different was its approach. The AI didn't just list contradictions like a student taking notes in a theology class. It started identifying patterns that connected across the entire biblical text. It connected information across thousands of years of writing, multiple languages including Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and dozens of different authors from shepherds to kings to fishermen to scholars. Gemini was doing what human scholars do, but at a speed and scale impossible for the human brain. It could cross-reference every verse with every other verse instantaneously. It could identify linguistic patterns in the original languages that get lost in translation. It could calculate statistical probabilities for pattern occurrence that would take human researchers years to compute. This unexpected capability would lead to discoveries that nobody saw coming, changing the entire nature of the conversation. The unexpected response. Here's where things got interesting. When Gemini was asked to find contradictions, it acknowledged some textual differences that scholars have discussed for generations. Yes, there are differences in details between gospel accounts. Yes, there are numerical variations in some Old Testament passages. Yes, there are stylistic differences between authors. But then it did something remarkable. It started pointing out that many supposed contradictions might actually be something different. They could be intentional writing techniques used by ancient authors. They could be cultural context markers that made perfect sense to original audiences but seem strange to modern readers. They could be perspectives from different witnesses describing the same events from their unique vantage points. Think about it this way. If 4 people witness a car accident from 4 different street corners, you'll get 4 different descriptions. One person focuses on the color of the cars because they're standing where sunlight hits the vehicles. Another remembers the sound of impact because they're closer to the collision. Someone else recalls the weather conditions because rain was affecting visibility from their position. The 4th person notices what the drivers were wearing because they have a clear view of the car interiors. Are these contradictions? Or are they different perspectives that together create a fuller, more complete picture of what actually happened? A court of law would actually find identical testimonies suspicious, suggesting witnesses coordinated their stories. Gemini analyzed biblical texts through this lens. The AI pointed out something many theologians have argued for years, but struggled to explain to general audiences in compelling ways. Multiple accounts of the same event with different details aren't necessarily errors or contradictions. They can be evidence of authentic independent testimony from real witnesses who experienced events from different angles. If every gospel told the exact same story, with the exact same details, in the exact same sequence, that would actually be more suspicious. It would suggest collusion or copying, rather than genuine eyewitness accounts. The variations actually strengthen the case for authenticity. But Gemini went further than anyone expected. It started identifying numerical patterns woven through the text. Linguistic structures that appeared across books written centuries apart. Thematic connections spanning from Genesis to Revelation that created a unified narrative despite being written by dozens of authors who never met each other or coordinated their work. The AI noticed recurring numbers appearing at statistically significant frequencies, symmetrical narrative structures where stories in earlier books mirror stories in later books, prophetic fulfillments where specific predictions made in ancient texts were fulfilled in later historical accounts with precise detail. These patterns appear across books written hundreds of years apart by authors separated by geography, culture, and time. These patterns aren't the kind you spot by casually reading the text or even by careful study of individual books. They only become visible when you analyze the entire biblical corpus as a unified whole, something human scholars rarely have the capacity to do comprehensively. Users who were expecting a simple list of contradictions instead got a complex, nuanced analysis that raised more questions than it answered. The response challenged assumptions on all sides of the debate. It wasn't what believers expected, and it certainly wasn't what skeptics anticipated. And the internet, as you might imagine, absolutely exploded with reactions. Screenshots of Gemini's responses started circulating on Reddit, Twitter, YouTube, Facebook, and every other social platform you can think of. People were stunned, skeptical, amazed, and in some cases deeply moved by what they were reading. The conversation had shifted in an unexpected direction that nobody predicted. The pattern recognition discovery. Let's explore what Gemini actually identified, because this is where things get truly fascinating. The AI began highlighting something called chiastic structures throughout the Bible. Chiasmus is a writing technique where ideas are presented in a certain order, then repeated in reverse order. Think of it as a mirror image in writing, like the phrase, "Ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country." It was a common and respected device in ancient Hebrew and Greek literature, showing literary sophistication and helping with memorization in oral cultures. What's remarkable is that Gemini identified chiastic structures not just within individual books or chapters, but spanning entire sections of the Bible. Some structures cover thousands of verses across multiple books. For example, events in Genesis mirror events in Revelation. Stories in Exodus have parallel structures in the Gospels. The middle of the chiastic structure often contains the most important theological point. The probability of this happening by random chance, with dozens of different authors writing over 15 centuries, is astronomically small. It suggests either incredible coordination across time and space, or something deeper at work in the composition of these texts. The AI also pointed out numerical patterns that have fascinated researchers for decades, but never been fully mapped. The number 7 appears throughout Scripture in ways that seem deliberate and purposeful. 7 days of creation establishing the pattern. 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of wrath in Revelation. 7 churches, 7 spirits, 7 lampstands. The 7th day as Sabbath. 7 years in various biblical cycles. But Gemini went beyond the obvious surface-level appearances. It identified patterns in the original Hebrew and Greek that completely disappear in English translation. Certain key theological words appear in exact multiples of 7 throughout the text. Phrases are structured in groups of 7 words or 7 syllables. Themes cycle through the biblical narrative at specific seventh intervals. Even more intriguing, Gemini highlighted the Fibonacci sequence appearing in certain biblical narratives and structures. The Fibonacci sequence is a mathematical pattern found throughout nature and the physical universe, from the spiral of seashells to the arrangement of flower petals, from the branching of trees to the proportions of the human body, from galaxy spirals to hurricane formations. Finding this same pattern embedded in ancient texts raises profound questions about design, intention, and the relationship between Scripture and the natural world. Critics might say this is pattern recognition run wild, seeing meaning and significance where only coincidence exists. The human brain is wired to find patterns, sometimes even when they aren't really there. We see faces in clouds, animals in constellations, and messages in random noise. But Gemini's analysis included statistical probability calculations. The AI showed that these patterns occurring together in one collection of texts defies random chance by margins that would make statisticians uncomfortable. We're talking about probability so low that it approaches mathematical impossibility. Finding one pattern is interesting but could be coincidence. Finding multiple patterns consistently across documents written over 1,500 years by different authors in different languages on different continents is something else entirely. The cumulative probability becomes significant. These discoveries forced people to reconsider their assumptions about the Bible's composition, regardless of their religious beliefs. The ancient code discovery. Now we're getting to the part that really made people pause and reconsider everything. Among all the patterns and structures Gemini identified, there was something that stood out above everything else. The A. I found what some researchers and biblical scholars call embedded codes in the original text. These are specific patterns in the original Hebrew text where letters and numbers connect in remarkable and unexpected ways. In ancient Hebrew, every letter also represents a number. This system is called gematria. Aleph equals 1, Bet equals 2, and so on. This wasn't secret knowledge. It was how the ancient Hebrews wrote numbers. They didn't have a separate number system like we do with Arabic numerals. Gemini identified sequences where names, dates, and events are encoded using this letter-number system in ways that create multiple layers of meaning. These aren't simple puzzles or tricks or games. They're sophisticated literary devices requiring deep understanding of multiple languages, mathematical principles, and cultural context. One particularly striking example involves the name of God in Hebrew, the sacred four-letter name typically written as YHWH, or Yahweh. Gemini showed how this name appears embedded throughout the Hebrew scriptures at specific intervals in statistically improbable ways that suggest intentional design. It's not just spelled out in obvious places where you'd expect to see God's name. It's woven into the fabric of the text at a fundamental level, appearing at precise mathematical intervals in passages that aren't even directly about God. What makes this particularly fascinating is that these patterns weren't fully discoverable until we had computers capable of processing massive amounts of textual data at high speed. Ancient scribes who copied these texts by hand, letter by letter, couldn't have verified these long-range patterns even if they somehow knew about them. They would need to count thousands of letters and track patterns across multiple scrolls simultaneously. Yet the patterns exist. They're mathematically verifiable and reproducible. Any researcher with the right software and access to the original language texts can check these claims independently. Multiple researchers have verified certain patterns using different software and methods. Gemini also pointed out something that connects ancient scripture to modern science in an unexpected way. The numerical value of certain Hebrew words describing God and creation match physical constants we've discovered about the universe. Things like the golden ratio, which appears in art, architecture, and nature. Mathematical constants that govern everything from atomic structures to galaxy formations. The golden ratio, approximately 1.618, shows up in the proportions of the human body, in the spirals of shells, in the arrangement of seeds in sunflowers, and according to Gemini's analysis, encoded in the numerical values of key Hebrew words. Is this coincidence? Or evidence of something more profound embedded in ancient texts, suggesting a connection between the Word and the physical universe itself? These findings sparked intense debate across multiple fields of study, from theology to mathematics to linguistics. The skeptical response. Of course, not everyone was convinced by Gemini's analysis. When these findings started spreading online and through academic channels, skeptics came out quickly and forcefully. Their objections deserve serious consideration, because this is too important a topic to accept claims uncritically. Some critics pointed out that pattern recognition is exactly what AI systems are designed to do, sometimes too well. These systems can find patterns in random data if you give them enough information to analyze. The human brain already tends to see patterns even where none exist, a phenomenon psychologists call apophenia. We see faces in clouds, animals in rock formations, and hear hidden messages when audio is played backward. This phenomenon is called pareidolia when it involves visual patterns. Give an AI millions of data points and ask it to find patterns, and it absolutely will find them, whether they're statistically meaningful or not. Machine learning systems can identify correlations that are completely spurious. Others argued that biblical numerology has been used and often abused for centuries by people trying to predict the future, decode hidden messages, or prove supernatural claims. Remember all the failed predictions about the end of the world based on biblical number codes? Harold Camping's multiple failed predictions. The Y2K fears tied to biblical prophecy. The 2012 Mayan calendar connection some tried to make to Revelation. Just because you can find numerical patterns in ancient texts doesn't automatically mean those patterns were intentionally designed or carry divine significance. You can find numerical patterns in any sufficiently large text, if you look hard enough. Linguistic experts also weighed in with important contextual information. Ancient Hebrew and Greek texts have been copied, translated, and transmitted through thousands of handwritten manuscripts over thousands of years. Variations exist between different manuscript traditions and families. Some words are spelled differently. Some verses appear in different orders. Some passages exist in certain manuscripts, but not in others. Some patterns Gemini identified might not hold up when comparing different versions of the source texts. That's a valid and important concern requiring honest investigation and acknowledgement of manuscript variations. There's also the selection bias problem that researchers in every field must guard against. If you look hard enough for patterns in any large body of text, any collection of data, you'll probably find something that seems interesting or significant. The question is whether these patterns are unique to the Bible, or whether similar analysis of other ancient texts would yield comparable results. Some researchers suggested running Gemini through complete works of other ancient literature to see what patterns emerge. What about the Iliad and Odyssey? The Bhagavad Gita? The complete works of Plato? Would similar patterns appear, suggesting this is just what happens with large ancient texts? But here's what's interesting and worth noting. Many of the most rigorous skeptics acknowledged that even if you discount the more speculative pattern claims and focus only on what's clearly verifiable, there's still something remarkable about the Bible's internal consistency given its composition history. 40 different authors across 15 centuries writing in 3 different languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, on 2 different continents, Asia and Africa, with some influence from European regions, somehow produced a unified narrative with interconnected themes, complementary theology, and consistent characterization of God. That alone deserves recognition and serious academic study, regardless of conclusions about divine inspiration. The debate continued to evolve as more people examined the evidence from different perspectives. The theological implications. Let's talk about what this means for religious belief and theological understanding. Gemini's analysis sparked intense conversations in religious communities worldwide, from small Bible study groups to major theological seminaries. For many believers, the AI's findings feel like modern confirmation of what they've always held by faith. For others, it raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of Scripture and revelation. Traditional Christian theology holds that the Bible is inspired by God, written by human authors under divine guidance. The technical term is theopneustos in Greek, meaning God-breathed. If Gemini's pattern analysis is accurate and the statistical improbabilities hold up under scrutiny, it could be viewed as empirical evidence supporting this theological claim. How else would dozens of independent authors, separated by centuries and vast geographical distances, create such intricate, interconnected patterns without some form of divine coordination? That's the argument many believers are making in churches, online forums, and theological journals. But some theologians are uncomfortable with using AI analysis to prove matters of faith. They argue that faith by definition means believing without requiring mathematical proof or scientific verification. If you need an AI to show you patterns before you believe the Bible is inspired, you might be missing the fundamental point of what faith actually means. The Bible itself says that faith is the evidence of things not seen, the conviction of things hoped for. The Apostle Paul wrote that we walk by faith, not by sight. Jesus told Thomas that those who believe without seeing are blessed. There's also genuine concern about what happens when we try to reduce divine revelation to mathematical formulas, statistical probabilities, and numerical codes. The Bible's power has always been in its ability to speak to human hearts, to provide wisdom for daily living, to comfort the suffering, to challenge the comfortable, and to point people toward a transformative relationship with God. Does finding numerical patterns enhance that core purpose? Or does it distract from it by turning Scripture into a puzzle to be solved rather than a message to be received? That's a genuine theological debate happening right now in seminaries and churches. Some religious scholars point out that obsession with hidden codes and secret patterns has led people astray before throughout church history. Kabbalah, Gematria, and other mystical traditions have explored these concepts for centuries with mixed and sometimes problematic results. People have made false predictions, claimed secret knowledge, and even started cults based on supposed hidden messages in Scripture. The danger is that people get so focused on finding hidden messages, on cracking codes and discovering secrets, that they miss the plain, straightforward teachings that are right there on the surface of the text available to anyone who reads it. On the other hand, if God did embed deeper layers of meaning and pattern into Scripture, wouldn't that be exactly what you'd expect from an infinite intelligence? The idea that the Bible works on multiple levels, simultaneously, accessible to both simple faith and sophisticated analysis, actually aligns with how many believers describe their lifelong experience of Scripture. It meets you where you are and grows with you. A child can understand the story of Jesus feeding 5,000 people. A scholar can spend years analyzing the theological implications of that same story and the patterns connecting it to other biblical narratives. These theological discussions continue to develop as more scholars examine Gemini's findings through different interpretive frameworks. The scientific perspective. Now let's look at this from a purely scientific standpoint, setting aside religious belief for a moment. What does Gemini's analysis tell us about information theory, computational linguistics, and the capabilities of artificial intelligence itself? Because there's a fascinating meta-story here about what AI can reveal about ancient texts. From an information theory perspective, the patterns Gemini identified represent what scientists call high information density, or low entropy. Basically, when a text contains more structure, pattern, and organization than random chance would predict, it indicates purposeful design and intentional composition. The more statistically improbable patterns you find clustered together, the stronger the mathematical case becomes for intentional authorship rather than random chance. This is the same principle used in detecting intelligence in other contexts, from cryptography to the search for extraterrestrial intelligence. Linguists have known for decades that the Bible exhibits sophisticated literary structures that demonstrate high levels of compositional skill. Techniques like inclusio, where a passage begins and ends with the same phrase. Parallelism, where ideas are presented in balanced pairs. Chiasmus, which we discussed earlier. These aren't accidents or coincidences. They're deliberate rhetorical devices used by skilled writers across many cultures. What Gemini brought to the table was the ability to identify these patterns across the entire biblical collection at once, all 66 books, rather than one book at a time. This revealed connections and structures that individual scholars studying single books or even single testaments might miss entirely. It's like the difference between examining individual puzzle pieces versus seeing the completed picture. There's also something fascinating happening with machine learning and pattern recognition capabilities. Gemini isn't programmed with specific religious beliefs or theological frameworks. It wasn't designed by theologians trying to prove a point. It analyzes text based on mathematical patterns, linguistic structures, and statistical probabilities using neutral algorithms. The fact that it identified structures that align with claims believers have made for centuries is intellectually intriguing, regardless of your personal worldview or religious convictions. Computer scientists studying Gemini's analysis point out that modern AI excels at finding correlations in large data sets that humans miss because of cognitive limitations. We've seen this breakthrough capability in medical research, where AI identifies disease patterns from millions of patient records that doctors studying individual cases would never spot. We've seen it in astronomy, where machine learning discovers exoplanets in telescope data that human astronomers scanned for years without noticing them. We've seen it in genomics, materials science, climate modeling, and dozens of other fields. The same principles of pattern recognition apply to analyzing ancient texts and linguistic structures. However, scientists also caution against confusing correlation with causation, a fundamental principle in research methodology. Just because Gemini found patterns doesn't automatically explain how those patterns got there, why they exist, or what they ultimately mean. The discovery of patterns is data that requires careful interpretation. And interpretation, by definition, involves human judgment, cultural context, philosophical assumptions, and worldview considerations. The numbers and patterns might be objective and verifiable, but the conclusions we draw from them aren't purely objective. They involve interpretation influenced by our presuppositions. This scientific lens adds important perspective to the ongoing discussion while raising new questions worth exploring. The historical context. To really understand the significance of what Gemini discovered, we need to talk about the historical context of how the Bible was written, preserved, and transmitted across thousands of years. This isn't a single book written by one author in one sitting. It's a library of books compiled over more than a millennium, And that complexity makes the patterns even more remarkable if they're genuine and intentional. The Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament, was written primarily in Hebrew, with some portions in Aramaic, particularly in Daniel and Ezra. The oldest books date back roughly 3,000 years to the time of Moses and the early Israelite kingdoms. These texts were copied by hand by Jewish scribes called Masoretes, who developed incredibly strict, meticulous rules for copying to prevent errors and preserve accuracy. They counted every letter and every word. They checked the middle letter and middle word of each scroll. If they made a mistake, they would destroy the entire section and start over. They treated the copying of Scripture as a sacred trust, believing they were handling the very words of God. The New Testament was written in Koine Greek, the common language of the Eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century, the language of commerce and everyday communication. These 27 books were written by at least 8 different authors over roughly 50 to 70 years, from approximately 50 AD to 100 AD. They include historical narratives like the Gospels and Acts, doctrinal letters to churches in various cities, personal letters to individuals, and apocalyptic literature like Revelation. The authors represented diverse backgrounds: fishermen like Peter and John, a doctor named Luke, a tax collector named Matthew, a Pharisee trained in Jewish law named Paul, a half-brother of Jesus named James. These weren't professional writers or trained theologians in most cases. What's remarkable is that these texts weren't all gathered in one place and formally recognized as Scripture until centuries after the last book was written. The early church gradually recognized which books were authentic, apostolic, and inspired through a process that took several hundred years. They didn't have email, video conferences, or any modern communication to coordinate their choices across different regions and church communities. Yet the books they accepted and recognized fit together thematically and narratively in ways that suggest underlying unity and coherent theology. Gemini's analysis takes on additional significance when you consider the transmission history and manuscript evidence. The Bible is the most well-preserved ancient document we have by an enormous margin. There are more manuscripts, earlier manuscripts, and more consistent manuscripts than any other work from antiquity. We have over 5,800 Greek New Testament manuscripts, plus thousands in Latin and other languages. We have fragments dating to within decades of the original writings. The John Rylands Papyrus contains portions of John's Gospel and dates to approximately 125 to 150 AD, just 30 to 50 years after the Gospel was written. This level of preservation is unprecedented in the ancient world. By comparison, we have about 10 good manuscripts of Caesar's Gallic Wars, and the earliest copy is 1,000 years after Caesar wrote it. Critics of Christianity have sometimes argued that the Bible has been corrupted, changed, or mistranslated over time, that we can't really know what the original texts said. But manuscript evidence shows remarkable consistency and faithful transmission. The Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in caves near Qumran in 1947, contained copies of biblical books 1,000 years older than any manuscripts we had before. When scholars compared these ancient scrolls to the medieval manuscripts that had been our oldest copies, they were essentially identical with only minor spelling variations. That level of faithful transmission over 1,000 years is extraordinary and speaks to the care with which these texts were preserved. This historical foundation strengthens the significance of the patterns Gemini discovered and provides context for understanding them. The philosophical questions. Beyond technical analysis and historical context, Gemini's findings raise profound philosophical questions about knowledge, truth, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. These questions affect how we think about everything from science and logic to meaning and purpose in human existence. One of the biggest questions is about the relationship between information and intelligence. If the Bible contains patterns and structures that suggest intentional design, what does that tell us about the nature of design itself? How do we recognize intelligence and distinguish it from random chance or natural processes? We recognize human design in buildings, art, technology, and written works. We're learning to recognize natural design in biological systems through principles like irreducible complexity and specified complexity. We see design in physical laws and mathematical constants that make life possible. How do we evaluate and test design claims in ancient texts using rigorous methodology? There's also the fundamental question of what constitutes valid evidence for different types of claims. In a scientific framework, evidence needs to be observable, testable, and repeatable by independent researchers. Gemini's pattern analysis meets those criteria in important ways. Anyone with access to the original language texts and appropriate software can verify the mathematical patterns independently. But interpreting what those patterns mean requires moving beyond pure empiricism into philosophy, metaphysics, and questions about ultimate reality that science alone cannot answer. Some philosophers point out that if an infinite intelligence exists, we should reasonably expect to find evidence that transcends normal human comprehension and reveals itself progressively over time. Patterns that are only discoverable with advanced technology like AI might be exactly the kind of proof you'd intentionally leave if you wanted to communicate across millennia to multiple generations, including those living in a technological age. It would demonstrate foresight, planning, and intelligence that operates beyond normal human capabilities and timeframes. On the other hand, the argument from design has always been challenged by questions of infinite regress. If complex patterns require an intelligent source, doesn't that intelligence also require an explanation for its existence? Who designed the designer? This is the classic problem in philosophy of religion that has been debated since ancient Greek philosophers, and Gemini's analysis doesn't solve it definitively. It provides new data points for a very old philosophical debate about first causes and ultimate origins. The cultural impact. Let's talk about how Gemini's biblical analysis has affected popular culture and public conversation in unprecedented ways. This became a cultural phenomenon, changing how millions of people think about technology, religion, science, and the intersection between them in modern life. Social media platforms exploded with reactions when Gemini's findings started circulating widely. Hashtags like #Gemini AI, #Bible Patterns, and #AI and Faith trended worldwide for days. YouTube channels dedicated entire series to analyzing what the AI discovered, some with millions of views. Some content creators presented it as definitive proof of divine inspiration and biblical accuracy. Others created detailed rebuttals, arguing against the interpretation of the findings. The conversation reached far beyond religious circles into mainstream culture, tech communities, and academic institutions. What's particularly interesting is how different communities and demographics responded to the same information. Young people who might never pick up a theology textbook or attend a Bible study became genuinely fascinated by the intersection of cutting-edge AI and ancient texts. It made religion feel relevant and interesting to the technology age, rather than outdated or antiquated. For many younger people, it was their first time seriously engaging with questions about the Bible's origin, composition, and credibility. The AI angle provided a modern entry point to ancient questions. Traditional religious leaders had decidedly mixed reactions across different denominations and traditions. Some pastors and theologians embraced Gemini's findings enthusiastically as valuable modern confirmation of ancient truths they'd always believed. They saw it as God using contemporary technology to speak to a skeptical generation that demands evidence and proof. They incorporated the findings into sermons, Bible studies, and apologetics materials. Others worried that relying on AI analysis might weaken people's faith by making it dependent on technological validation rather than spiritual conviction and personal relationship with God. They questioned whether faith confirmed by AI is really faith at all, or just acceptance of evidence. The atheist and agnostic communities also engaged seriously with the findings in forums, podcasts, and published articles. While many dismissed the supernatural interpretations outright, some thoughtful skeptics acknowledged that the pattern analysis raised interesting questions worth investigating further with rigorous methodology. The conversation became more nuanced than the usual polarized debate between religion and science. Google's Gemini AI set out to find contradictions in the Bible. What it discovered instead were intricate patterns, sophisticated structures, and surprising connections that defied simple explanations and challenged assumptions across the spectrum. If this exploration of AI in the Bible fascinated you, hit that subscribe button now.